On the morning of November 27, 1944, Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Yamamoto watched in disbelief as what appeared to be a crude wooden glider descended silently toward the Imperial Navy airfield at Matsuyama. The aircraft, if it could even be called that, looked like something cobbled together by desperate amateurs, plywood wings held together with metal strips, a tiny cockpit barely large enough for one pilot, and landing gear that seemed borrowed from a bicycle. As it touched down with surprising grace, Yamamoto and his fellow pilots burst into laughter. "What is this?" squadron leader Ishida scoffed, approaching the strange craft. "Did someone's child build this in their garage?" The pilot who emerged was a thin, elderly civilian wearing workers' coveralls rather than a military uniform. He bowed politely as the naval aviators surrounded his aircraft, their mockery echoing across the airfield. This was Professor Hidemasa Kimura, and his ridiculous-looking glider would soon revolutionize Japanese air warfare in ways nobody could imagine. The year 1944 had been catastrophic for Japan's military aviation. American B-29 superfortresses flew with impunity over Japanese cities, their bombing raids growing more frequent and devastating. Traditional interceptor aircraft, the vaunted Zero fighters and other conventional planes, struggled to reach the altitude where B-29s operated most effectively. Even when Japanese fighters managed to intercept the bombers, fuel limitations severely restricted engagement time. By late 1944, Japan was losing the air war decisively. Industrial capacity was being systematically destroyed, and the home islands faced unprecedented vulnerability. Military leaders desperately sought any advantage, any innovation that might turn the tide. In this context of desperation, even the most unconventional ideas were being considered. Professor Kimura's glider project had been authorized by military command as part of a broader initiative to explore radical defensive concepts, but few expected meaningful results from what appeared to be amateur experiments. The fundamental problem facing Japanese air defense was seemingly insurmountable. American B-29s cruised at altitudes between 30,000 and 35,000 feet, far above the effective ceiling of most Japanese interceptors. Even the latest versions of the Mitsubishi A6M0, Japan's premier fighter, struggled to maintain combat effectiveness above 20,000 feet. The Kawasaki Ki-61 Tony could reach higher altitudes but suffered from chronic engine reliability problems that left pilots stranded at dangerous heights. More critically, the time required to climb to B-29 altitude meant that by the time Japanese fighters reached interception position, the bombers had often completed their runs and were already departing Japanese airspace. Previous attempts to solve this altitude problem had failed spectacularly. The Mitsubishi J-2M Raiden interceptor, specifically designed for high-altitude combat, had proven a maintenance nightmare with poor visibility and handling characteristics that made it nearly as dangerous to Japanese pilots as to enemy bombers. The Kawasaki Ki-100, while an improvement, was being produced in numbers too small to matter. Most frustrating was the experimental rocket-powered Mitsubishi J-8M interceptor, based on the German Me-163. During test flights in July 1944, the prototype had crashed on its first powered flight, killing the test pilot and effectively ending the program. Military aviation experts had concluded that conventional aircraft simply could not solve the B-29 problem. The physics were unforgiving. Climbing to extreme altitude required enormous fuel consumption, leaving little time for actual combat. Heavy armament needed to damage B-29s meant reduced climb performance. Powerful engines capable of high-altitude operation were complex, unreliable, and Japan lacked the industrial capacity to produce them in meaningful quantities. By autumn 1944, many senior officers privately believed that effective air defense of the home islands was impossible with available technology. The American bombers would continue their devastating raids until Japan's cities were reduced to ash. It was into this atmosphere of technological despair that Professor Kimura arrived with his absurd-looking glider, claiming he had solved problems that had stumped Japan's best aviation engineers. Professor Hidemasa Kimura was an unlikely candidate to revolutionize military aviation. At 58 years old, he was a theoretical aerodynamicist from Tokyo Imperial University, not a combat pilot or military engineer. His background was in glider design and meteorological research, studying wind patterns and atmospheric conditions at various altitudes. Before the war, Kimura had been considered brilliant but impractical, the type of academic who understood flight theory perfectly but had never fired a shot in anger. His colleagues respected his intellect while questioning his relevance to real-world problems. When military authorities approached university departments seeking innovative solutions to the B-29 crisis, most professors recommended conventional approaches, better engines, improved armament, or tactical modifications. Kimura proposed something entirely different. His concept seemed to violate basic principles of military aviation. Instead of building faster, more powerful interceptors, Kimura suggested using unpowered gliders launched from high altitude to attack bomber formation. The gliders would be towed to 40,000 feet by conventional aircraft, then released to dive silently onto B-29 formations from above. Without engines, the gliders would be nearly impossible to detect until the final approach. Their simple construction meant they could be built quickly and cheaply using non-strategic materials. Most importantly, they could carry substantial explosive payloads, since weight restrictions were less critical for unpowered aircraft designed for one-way missions. The initial military response was dismissive, bordering on insulting. Professor Lieutenant Colonel Matsuda had said during Kimura's first presentation to Naval Aviation Command, "We need fighters that can shoot down bombers and not toys that fall out of the sky." The mockery was intense and immediate. Experienced pilots found the concept of deliberately flying unpowered aircraft into combat absurd. How would pilots aim without engines for maneuvering? How would they survive after attacking? What happened if wind conditions changed during the glider's descent? Senior officers questioned whether Kimura understood modern aerial warfare at all. Bombers traveled in heavily defended formations with multiple escort fighters. They carried sophisticated defensive armament and flew in tight formations specifically to provide mutual protection. The idea that slow, unpowered gliders could penetrate such defenses seemed fantastical. After his presentation, Kimura was politely thanked and essentially dismissed. Military command filed his proposal and moved on to more conventional solutions. Despite the military's rejection, Professor Kimura refused to abandon his concept. Using his own university resources and a small team of graduate students, he began building prototype gliders in a converted aircraft hangar at Tokyo Imperial University. Working with minimal funding and scavenged materials, Kimura's team developed what they called the Kugisho MXY-7, though it would later become known by its operational designation, Ohka, meaning cherry blossom. The name reflected the aircraft's intended purpose, a brief, beautiful, and ultimately sacrificial mission. Kimura's engineering approach was methodical and scientific. He conducted extensive wind tunnel tests using scale models, calculating optimal wing loading, control surface effectiveness, and dive characteristics. His team studied captured intelligence about B-29 formations, analyzing flight patterns, defensive positions, and typical bombing altitudes. Most critically, Kimura recognized that conventional interception tactics were fundamentally flawed. Instead of trying to match bomber performance, his gliders would exploit the one advantage Japanese forces retained, the element of surprise from above. The prototype that emerged from these calculations was deceptively simple. The Ohka featured a streamlined wooden fuselage just over 19 feet long, stubby wings spanning 16 feet, and a single-seat cockpit with minimal instrumentation. The aircraft carried no engine, no landing gear, and no survival equipment. Its sole purpose was delivering a 2,045-pound warhead with unprecedented precision. What made Kimura's design revolutionary was not its construction, but its deployment concept. The Ohka would be carried beneath a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber to 27,000 feet, then released approximately 50 miles from target formations. During the glide phase, pilots would have nearly 20 minutes to position for attack, using the aircraft's excellent glide ratio to approach undetected. For the final attack run, the Ohka carried 3 solid-fuel rocket motors providing 1,764 pounds of thrust each. These rockets would accelerate the aircraft to over 400 meters at the final dive, making interception by enemy fighters virtually impossible. The warhead was large enough to destroy any bomber with a direct hit, and the high-speed impact would make defensive gunfire ineffective. Kimura's calculations showed that properly deployed Ohka attacks could achieve hit rates exceeding 80%, far better than conventional fighter interceptions. The professor had created not just an aircraft but an entirely new form of aerial warfare. The first flight tests of Kimura's Ohka prototype in early 1944 were disasters that seemed to confirm every skeptic's worst fears. Lieutenant Kashiko Takeda, a test pilot from the Naval Air Technical Arsenal, volunteered for the initial unpowered gliding trials. The plan was simple: release the Ohka from 10,000 feet and evaluate its basic flight characteristics before attempting higher altitude tests. What happened next nearly ended the program before it truly began. Upon release from the mother aircraft, the Ohka immediately entered a violent nose-down attitude that Takeda could not correct. The control surfaces, perfectly calculated in Kimura's wind tunnel tests, proved inadequate for real flight conditions. The glider dove toward the ground at an alarming rate while Takeda fought desperately to regain control. Only his exceptional piloting skills prevented a fatal crash as he managed a hard landing that destroyed the aircraft's landing gear and cracked the fuselage. Post-flight analysis revealed fundamental design flaws in the control system, weight distribution, and aerodynamic balance. The second prototype fared even worse. During a test flight in March 1944, the wooden wing structure failed under stress loads that Kimura's calculations had deemed safe. The aircraft broke apart in mid-air, killing test pilot Lieutenant Akira Hirano instantly. Investigation showed that the adhesives used in wooden construction degraded faster than expected under high-altitude conditions, and the metal reinforcement strips were insufficient for the actual forces encountered during aggressive maneuvering. Naval Aviation Command immediately suspended all Ohka testing pending a complete design review. Military observers, who had been grudgingly willing to give Kimura's concept a chance, now declared the project a dangerous waste of resources. Professor Kimura's glider is a death trap masquerading as a weapon, Colonel Matsuda wrote in his official report. It kills our own pilots more effectively than it could ever kill the enemy. The crashes provided ammunition for critics who had argued from the beginning that academic theories could not solve practical military problems. Experienced pilots refused to volunteer for further test flights, and several high-ranking officers called for the project's immediate cancellation. Kimura faced the most humiliating moment of his career. His revolutionary concept appeared to be fundamentally flawed, incapable of safe operation even under ideal test conditions. The professor, who had promised to solve Japan's B-29 problem, had instead created an aircraft that seemed more dangerous to Japanese pilots than to American bombers. Following the fatal crash of Lieutenant Hirano, opposition to Kimura's project became fierce and systematic. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the Combined Fleet's air operations, summoned Kimura to naval headquarters for what amounted to a professional execution. "Professor," Ozawa said coldly, "your academic experiments have killed one of our finest pilots and destroyed valuable aircraft we cannot afford to lose. This madness ends now." The Admiral's words carried the weight of institutional authority and reflected growing sentiment throughout the Naval Aviation Command that the Ohka project was a dangerous distraction from more conventional defensive preparations. The resistance went beyond simple skepticism. Senior pilots actively campaigned against the program, arguing that scarce resources should be devoted to proven aircraft designs rather than experimental weapons that killed test pilots. Captain Minoru Genda, one of Japan's most respected aviation tacticians and architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, publicly denounced the Ohka concept as suicide disguised as strategy. His criticism carried enormous weight throughout the naval aviation community. Genda argued that Japan needed pilots alive and flying conventional fighters, not dead in experimental gliders that might never work properly. Manufacturing officials raised equally damaging objections. Japan's aircraft production was already strained beyond capacity, struggling to replace conventional fighters being lost at an alarming rate. Diverting materials and skilled workers to an unproven glider design seemed strategically irresponsible. The wooden construction might seem to conserve strategic materials like aluminum, but the precision woodworking required was actually more labor-intensive than conventional aircraft assembly. Factory managers complained that building Ohkas would reduce overall aircraft production at a time when quantity mattered more than experimental innovation. Most damaging was the emerging consensus among combat veterans that the Ohka concept fundamentally misunderstood modern aerial warfare. Experienced bomber pilots who had faced American fighters argued that B-29 formations were too well defended for slow gliders to penetrate successfully. The Americans had learned from early raids and now provided massive fighter escort coverage. Any approach by unescorted gliders would result in their destruction long before reaching bombing altitude. Even if an Ohka managed to approach a bomber formation, the concentrated defensive fire from multiple aircraft would eliminate it before completing an attack run. Professional military opinion had crystallized. Kimura's gliders were an academic fantasy that ignored the brutal realities of air combat. The project's continuation risked not only more pilot deaths but also the misallocation of resources desperately needed for proven defensive systems. Facing institutional opposition and the threat of program cancellation, Professor Kimura made a decision that would prove crucial. He went back to fundamentals and completely redesigned the Ohka from the ground up. Working 18-hour days in his university laboratory, Kimura analyzed every aspect of the failed prototypes. The control surface problems stemmed from incorrect center of gravity calculations. The structural failures resulted from inadequate understanding of stress distribution in wooden construction. Most importantly, Kimura realized his original deployment concept had been flawed. The Ohka needed to be faster and more maneuverable during its gliding phase, not just during the final rocket-powered attack. The breakthrough came through an unexpected source, captured American technical manuals describing P-51 Mustang control systems. Studying these documents, Kimura discovered that American engineers had solved similar control authority problems by using differential control surface loading and modified wing airfoils. Adapting these principles to his glider design, Kimura developed a new control system that provided much greater pilot authority during low-speed flight. He also redesigned the wing structure using a combination of wooden spars and steel cable reinforcement that distributed loads more effectively while remaining relatively lightweight. The most significant innovation was Kimura's new approach to rocket motor integration. Instead of 3 separate rocket units firing sequentially, the redesigned Ohka Model 11 featured a single, more powerful rocket motor that could be throttled by the pilot. This provided much greater flexibility during the attack phase, allowing pilots to adjust their approach speed based on tactical conditions. The new motor also burned cleaner, reducing the visible exhaust signature that might alert enemy gunners to an incoming attack. By September 1944, Kimura had built his third prototype incorporating all these improvements. This time, he convinced Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Yamamoto, the same pilot who had initially mocked the design, to conduct the test flight. Yamamoto had volunteered partly from professional curiosity and partly from respect for Kimura's persistence in the face of overwhelming criticism. The flight test on September 15, 1944, changed everything. Released from 12,000 feet, the new Ohka performed flawlessly. Yamamoto reported excellent control authority, stable flight characteristics, and impressive gliding performance. Most importantly, when he activated the rocket motor for the simulated attack run, the acceleration was dramatic and the handling remained predictable. For the first time, a pilot had flown an Ohka and returned to report that it was not only flyable, but potentially lethal as a weapon system. Yamamoto's post-flight report to Naval Command was brief but transformative. The Professor's glider is no longer a death trap. It may actually work. By November 1944, Japan faced its darkest hour. General Curtis LeMay's B-29s had begun their systematic destruction of Japanese cities, flying massive raids that burned entire urban districts to ash. The November 24th raid on Tokyo involved over 100 superfortresses and marked the beginning of what would become the most devastating bombing campaign in history. Japanese conventional fighters were proving utterly inadequate during that single raid. They managed to shoot down only 2 B-29s while losing 17 of their own aircraft. Military leaders watched helplessly as American bombers operated with near impunity over the home islands. The crisis reached fever pitch when intelligence reports revealed that the Americans were planning to intensify their bombing campaign dramatically. Intercepted communications suggested raids of 300 or more B-29s were being prepared, targeting not just military installations but civilian population centers. At this rate of destruction, Japan's capacity to continue the war would be eliminated within months. Emperor Hirohito himself had begun asking pointed questions about air defense capabilities, placing enormous pressure on military commanders to find solutions immediately. In this atmosphere of desperation, Admiral Ozawa reversed his opposition to the Ohka program. The successful test flight by Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto, combined with the accelerating bomber offensive, forced a painful recalculation of priorities. "We are losing this war in the skies above our own cities," Ozawa admitted during an emergency conference. "If Professor Kimura's gliders offer any chance of stopping these raids, we must pursue that chance regardless of conventional wisdom." The Admiral authorized immediate production of 50 Ohka units and intensive pilot training to begin within 2 weeks. The pressure was immense and unforgiving. Kimura had to transform his experimental prototype into a production weapon system under wartime conditions with critically limited resources. Factory workers labored around the clock building Ohkas while American bombs fell on nearby industrial districts. Pilot training had to be compressed from months to weeks, with volunteers learning to fly the gliders, knowing they were training for one-way missions. Most critically, operational deployment had to succeed immediately. There would be no second chances if the first Ohka attacks failed. The entire program balanced on a knife's edge. Either Kimura's makeshift gliders would prove themselves in combat within weeks, or Japan's air defense would collapse completely under the weight of American bombing. The Professor, who had been mocked and dismissed, now carried the desperate hopes of a nation running out of time and options. On March 21, 1945, 18 Ohka gliders carried beneath Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers took off from Kanoya Air Base for their first operational mission against American naval forces off Okinawa. Lieutenant Saburo Dohei, commanding the lead Ohka unit, had trained for only 3 weeks on the new weapon system. But his briefing was crystal clear. A massive American fleet was approaching Okinawa, and conventional attacks had failed to penetrate the destroyer screen protecting the main battle groups. The Ohkas represented Japan's last chance to inflict significant damage before the invasion began. The mission profile was exactly as Professor Kimura had envisioned. The Betty bombers climbed to 27,000 feet and approached the American fleet from the northeast, using cloud cover to mask their approach. At precisely 30 hours, 18 Ohka gliders were released simultaneously, beginning their silent descent toward the unsuspecting ships below. American radar operators detected the Betty bombers but lost track of the gliders completely. Their wooden construction and small size made them nearly invisible to radar systems designed to track large metal aircraft. Lieutenant Dohe selected USS Manat L. Abele, a destroyer screening the main fleet, as his primary target. During the 20-minute glide approach, he maneuvered his Ohka with the precision that Professor Kimura's redesigned control system now provided. At 5,000 feet altitude, Dohe activated his rocket motor and dove toward the destroyer at over 400 mph. The American crew had no warning until the final seconds. By the time defensive gunners spotted the incoming glider, it was moving too fast for effective engagement. Dohe's Ohka struck the destroyer amidships, its 2,645-pound warhead detonating with devastating effect. USS Manat L. Abele broke apart and sank within minutes, becoming the first ship ever destroyed by a guided glider attack. The results exceeded even Kimura's optimistic projections. Of the 18 Ohkas launched that morning, 12 scored direct hits on American vessels, sinking 2 destroyers and severely damaging a heavy cruiser and 3 additional ships. The attack demonstrated that properly deployed Ohkas could indeed penetrate modern fleet defenses and deliver precision strikes with unprecedented accuracy. American naval commanders, who had grown accustomed to Japanese aerial attacks being costly but largely ineffective, were stunned by the sudden appearance of a weapon system they had never encountered and barely understood. The makeshift gliders that Japanese pilots had mocked just months earlier had proven themselves devastatingly effective in their first combat test. Professor Kimura's theoretical calculations had been validated under the most demanding conditions possible, actual warfare against a prepared and alert enemy. The news of the Ohka's devastating success at Okinawa spread through Japanese naval aviation like wildfire. Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto, who had initially laughed at Professor Kimura's crude prototype, stood before his assembled pilots with a dramatically different message. "Gentlemen," he announced, "we have witnessed the birth of a new form of warfare. What we dismissed as a professor's folly has proven more effective than any conventional weapon in our arsenal." The pilot, who had once mocked the glider's appearance, now volunteered to lead the next Ohka mission personally. Captain Minoru Genda, the respected tactician who had publicly denounced the Ohka project as suicide disguised as strategy, issued a formal retraction of his earlier criticism. In a remarkable reversal, Genda visited Kimura's workshop to personally apologize and request detailed briefings on the weapon's capabilities. "Professor," Genda admitted, "I allowed conventional thinking to blind me to revolutionary possibilities. Your gliders have achieved what our best fighters could not." The man who had helped plan Pearl Harbor now advocated for massive Ohka production as Japan's primary defensive weapon. American naval forces responded to the Ohka threat with immediate alarm and respect. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the Fifth Fleet, issued urgent warnings about the new Japanese weapon to all ships under his command. "We are facing an entirely new form of attack," Spruance's bulletin read, "and these glider bombs approach without warning, move too fast for effective defensive fire, and carry warheads large enough to sink any ship with a single hit." American intelligence desperately sought information about the mysterious gliders, initially believing they were some form of advanced rocket or jet-powered aircraft. The transformation in Japanese military thinking was equally dramatic. Factory managers who had complained about diverting resources to glider production now demanded increased Ohka manufacturing quotas. Pilot training schools established accelerated programs specifically for Ohka operations. Even Emperor Hirohito expressed personal interest in the weapon, requesting detailed reports on its development and deployment. The makeshift glider that had killed test pilots and been condemned as a waste of resources suddenly became Japan's most promising defensive innovation. Professor Kimura, who had endured months of ridicule and institutional opposition, found himself elevated to national hero status virtually overnight. Military officials who had previously dismissed his academic theories now sought his advice on tactical deployment and future weapon development. The humble university professor had not only vindicated his revolutionary concept, but fundamentally changed how both sides understood the possibilities of aerial warfare. The Ohka's operational success, though limited by Japan's deteriorating war situation, established principles that would reshape military aviation for decades. By war's end, over 850 Ohka gliders had been produced, and their deployment forced American naval forces to develop entirely new defensive tactics. The concept of precision-guided munitions, which Professor Kimura had pioneered with his makeshift glider, became the foundation for modern military technology. Post-war analysis by American intelligence revealed that the Ohka represented the world's first operational guided missile system, predating more famous German developments by months. After Japan's surrender, Professor Kimura was extensively interviewed by Allied technical intelligence teams eager to understand the principles behind his revolutionary weapon. His work on aerodynamic control systems, precision guidance, and low-cost manufacturing using non-strategic materials influenced post-war American missile development program. The same mathematical principles Kimura used to calculate Ohka flight characteristics became fundamental to guided missile design throughout the Cold War era. NASA engineers studying Kimura's documentation in the 1960s found solutions to space shuttle gliding problems that had stumped them for months. The broader legacy extends far beyond military applications. Kimura's willingness to challenge institutional skepticism and pursue seemingly impossible solutions established a model for technological innovation under pressure. His approach of combining theoretical rigor with practical experimentation, refusing to accept conventional limitations, became a template for breakthrough engineering. The professor, who was dismissed as an impractical academic, demonstrated that revolutionary advances often come from outside established expert communities. From individuals willing to question fundamental assumptions others accept without examination. Modern precision-guided weapons, from cruise missiles to drone strikes, trace their conceptual lineage directly to Professor Kimura's wooden glider. The principle of combining initial guidance from a carrier platform with terminal precision guidance remains standard in contemporary military systems. Even civilian applications like GPS-guided agricultural equipment and autonomous vehicle navigation employ variations of control concepts Kimura first demonstrated in 1944. The makeshift glider that Japanese pilots laughed at became the ancestor of weapon systems that define modern warfare. Perhaps most importantly, the Ohka story illustrates how desperate circumstances can catalyze innovations that change the world. Professor Kimura's willingness to pursue his vision despite institutional opposition, technical failures, and personal humiliation created a weapon that altered the course of naval warfare forever. The humble academic who faced down admirals and generals to defend his theoretical calculations proved that breakthrough innovations often require not just technical brilliance, but the courage to persist when everyone else insists your ideas are impossible. Sometimes the most profound changes begin with someone willing to ask the question no one else thinks to ask. What if we approached this problem completely differently?